So everyone, I'd like to introduce Rob Khazzam. He is a friend and someone who I've watched from afar do some incredible things over his career. Before joining Uber, Rob was in private equity, so he is familiar with the last crisis, given he was a capital provider during that time period, where he was at Fulcrum Capital Partners for about 4 years. I'll let him talk about that if he'd like to, but the main part of what people are probably dialing in for is Rob's experience at Uber for almost 5 years, where he was the general manager of Canada, as well as Eastern Europe and Central Europe, part of their international launch team. So Rob has firsthand experience in growth tactics, working on the ground, trying to build out new markets for obviously a large company like Uber, but almost as a startup operator by being one of the first employees on the ground during those times. Rob is also now working on something that is top secret. I'll let him dig into it if he'd like, but he is working on a new project that I've been fortunate enough to hear about and I think is quite exciting. He's Toronto born and raised, went to the Ivy School of Business, and he's an avid camper, hockey player, and traveler. Over to you, Rob.
Cool. Thanks. Thanks for the great introduction and for hosting me, Matt. And nice to meet all of you. Too bad we can't do this in person, but yeah, I mean, maybe just, I think Matt covered most of the, I guess the written highlights here, but as he mentioned, I grew up in Toronto. I went to business school at Ivy. I started my career in investing. I had always been really fascinated by investing. I don't know how many people are on the call did something different than they're doing now in the startup world, but have experienced a bunch of career pivots to date. And when I joined Uber in 2014, I was looking for something different. I'd spent 5 years working in private equity investing, sitting behind a computer, creating financial models, and doing arguably interesting work. But arguably not creating much in terms of tangible value, in terms of real life, real operating company experience. I didn't get to manage anyone really. I didn't have any marketing experience or sales experience. I didn't have operations experience, and I just had a lot of things that I wanted to do. And so through sort of serendipity and luck in 2014, I started networking. I wanted to get a job at a startup that was sort of the extent of what I thought I was going to be doing, and just learn how to build something new and join a great group of people that were working on something exciting. And I got lucky. I knew some people in the Toronto office at Uber, some guys that I had grown up with. They spoke really highly of the company, and I started interviewing with them for an international launcher role. I've been in Toronto. At that point, I was 28. I've been in Toronto for pretty much my whole life, and was really craving getting away and doing something uncomfortable and different. And so I got really lucky. Uber ended up hiring me onto this international launch team. It was probably the furthest possible thing I could have done for my private equity job, living in a condo in downtown Toronto. It was, you're going to join this international expansion team. You're going to be a launcher. You're going to be the first person in every new market that Uber launches in. You're going to be sent all around the world, all expenses paid. But you're gonna work your tail off 7 days a week, virtually 24 hours a day, and you're gonna move every 2 months. So it's gonna be really personally uncomfortable, but professionally it's gonna be an amazing learning experience. And so I did that over the next 15 months, bouncing around in Eastern Europe, launching different markets in Eastern Europe, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And then I was fortunate enough, I hired a great team, and Uber had a great product, which really sold itself. So I got to ride the wave and became later the general manager for Central and Eastern Europe, where I got to lead a team of about 125 people across 10 countries and 40 cities. Now, of course, that started with just me in an office in Prague, but over time it grew and obviously became something really special. And then in 2017, I came back. Uber sold its business in Eastern Europe. We were engaged in a really, really competitive battle with a company called Yandex, which is the search leader, the Google equivalent in Eastern Europe. And we decided to sell our business to them in Eastern Europe. And so I was out of a job in late 2017 and decided to come back to North America, be a little bit closer to my family and friends, and was lucky to become the GM for Uber Canada, the ride-sharing business, which I did for 2 years until this past summer, when I took a bunch of time off and am now working on a venture in the home financing space. So that's a bit about my background. I guess we can just flip into the Q&A, and I'll try to tie some of my experience and what I've learned into the answers to the questions you've given here. I'm certainly not an expert, but happy to share my thoughts on all things growth, and feel free to chime in and ask any other questions that aren't listed here.
That's awesome. Thanks, Rob. So let's just hop into it, everyone. Growth is the topic of your today. So let's go with the first question. What factors do you consider when assessing go-to-market strategies?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. And I look back at my experience at Uber. Uber expanded probably faster than any company in the world. When I joined Uber, we were in 60 cities in 2014. Within 12 months, we launched 150 cities. And 36 months later, we were in over 600 cities. And so Uber went really, really quick. And I'll talk maybe later about some of the highs and lows and challenges associated with that type of growth. But the things that Uber really had to right before they went and pursued a big go-to-market strategy were, one, and number one, I think always is product market fit or product market readiness. So if you're in a market and you have a product and it's adopted, it's got great NPS, it has, very few outages, it's getting really good feedback from your first few customers, you could call that product market fit. If it's product market readiness, maybe your product isn't in the market yet, but you've benchmarked it against existing products. So you can look at things like, what is the pricing of the substitutes or the competing products that exist in the market? What types of features or value propositions might they have? Maybe that's time to delivery or speed or efficiency or something like that. And you can do a bit of basic benchmarking to see if that product is likely, in theory at least, to be considered ready for market adoption. And I think that the tough part about figuring out when to launch and when to move is there's a tension, and I'm sure Matt has spent a lot of time with you guys about this topic, which is on the one end of the spectrum, getting going as quickly as possible, spinning up an MVP, getting in the market and getting feedback as quickly as possible and iterating on that. Versus the risk of launching into a market, having a bunch of customers try your product, have it break or not wow them, and then have them decide that they don't want to use you again. And so there's always a really fine line to work with. And I think, you can cheat a little bit by finding, ideally 20 to 30 people within your inner orbit, 2 to 3 degrees away from you, friends, family, friends of friends, who you can say, hey, can you try this product? Can you give me a bit of feedback? If you're getting overwhelmingly positive feedback from that group, then I think you're probably ready to go to market. In terms of the general idea though, once your product is ready and you want to move into a market, one of the most important things I think that you want to look at is how you're going to market that product. Who are the customers that you want to sell to? And is there existing industry distribution? So for example, I'm looking at a business right now in the home financing space. 75% of all mortgages in Canada are originated by mortgage brokers. They're not actually done directly through the banks. They're not done directly through websites. They're done through mortgage brokers. So if you were going to build a business that provides home financing solutions to the Canadian marketplace and Canadian consumers, you'd probably want to give a really hard look at your distribution strategy. And given the structure of that market, think about whether partnering with one of those distributors makes sense early on. If a partnership outright isn't possible, you may want to think about incentive structures or ways to incentivize and reward those partners for providing your product in return for a fee. So those are the types of things that I would look at. I think the last one, and is really important, is to think about the footprint of your team, particularly if you're in a really logistically heavy business. Uber is a great example. Uber's market expansion strategy always started with a local team. It started with a general manager, an operations manager, and a marketing manager. And before those people were on the ground, it started with someone like me, a launcher. And my job was to go into that market and hire an unbelievable team, really bright, hardworking, extremely motivated and inspiring group that was really bought into the mission and was going to work their tail off to make it work. And truthfully, more often than not, when I reflect on my time at Uber and the markets that had dynamics that were most challenging, whether that was competition or regulatory or some other obstacle, the thing that I remember most about what helped us overcome that obstacle is not the tactic, it's the people. It's the people that came to work every day and said, well, we have this obstacle, but we're going to come to work every day and we're going to bang our head against the wall until we figure out how to do it. Because ultimately, great people who are working hard and kind of willing themselves through obstacles is going to be the driving force behind being successful and bringing your product to market.
Yeah, that's right. It's really interesting, the part you mentioned about the go-to-market readiness versus go-to-market strategy part. I think for a lot of our companies, we typically call them design partners when they're trying to get their product into the hands of users, but not trying to oversell it or kind of fake it till they make it with those kind of customers first. They have an understanding that you are a partner, you're helping iterate the product to a state where the value proposition is self-explanatory. I think with Uber, as you said earlier, it was product-led growth because the product sold itself. When you're in sort of the B2B and enterprise space, you're always trying to sell a future value of the product that the developers are going to be, releasing maybe in 3 to 6 months. How do you think about managing that sort of go-to-market readiness versus full-on go-to-market strategy as maybe a CEO or a senior salesperson, when you don't want to fall on your face, but you want to continue to stay ahead of the competition?
Yeah. So you mean in more of like a B2B environment where you ultimately are going to have to build some I mean, look, I'll caveat my answer with, I don't know. So I'll give you my opinion on it. But I think that ultimately comes down to relationships. So if I was building a business that relied really heavily on B2B relationships and adoption of my product from large organizations, one way or another, you're going to have to get close to the decision makers within those organizations or people in their orbit. And I think networking is obviously, ground zero, whether you go to trade shows, whether you reach out through LinkedIn, through mutual contacts. You need to find a way to get time with those people to understand what's your problem, what product are you using today, and how can I make that better? And then you need to take that information back to your team or your whiteboard or whatever it is and really think hard. Do I have something that I can bring to that person and say, hey, on a free trial basis, on a freemium basis, whatever it might be, give 2 or 3 people a demo of this product. I'm convinced it's going to blow your mind. And I think you need to have a lot of conviction that it's going to do that, because you're only going to get 1 or 2 cracks at having someone try a product before they stop responding to you, because sales in big organizations takes a long time. And I know firsthand at Uber, most people who worked at Uber in sort of public facing roles or in leadership roles got a lot of inbounds, a lot of LinkedIn requests. So you need to be really thoughtful about doing that.
Appreciate that. Next question. When looking at my growth strategy, how should I assess my product readiness, customer acquisition, and retention strategies and monetization? So kind of leading into that, am I ready for the go-to-market? These are some of the questions you asked.
Yeah, I mean, I would look at them almost in that order. So I'd always start with product readiness. I think customer acquisition is key. I think one of the big mistakes that, we talked already, I guess, about assessing product readiness, and maybe I'll leave that. But, on customer acquisition, I think one of the things that we did at Uber, which was really valuable, was, and I think Peter Thiel talks about it from 0 to 1, is doing things that don't scale. So I think there's this idea that when you build a startup, you create a product and then you run a bunch of Google and Facebook ads and then people start using your ads, your product. Forget it. It's super expensive. It's the worst way to meet your customers. If you're building a product that's that magical that people are going to use it, you should have no problem yourself finding 10 to 20 people who are going to use it through your own hard work and hustle. And Uber did that. When I launched, for example, in Eastern Europe, we weren't running any Facebook ads. We weren't running any Google. We would walk around and I would spend, the first few weeks literally hanging outside of airports, outside of bars, outside of the kinds of places that taxi drivers hung out at. And I would go talk to them and I would say, hey, I represent this American company. We have this app. This is the earnings opportunity for you. Here's why it's better than what you're doing. It's going to cost you nothing. Here's a way to download it. I'll put it on your phone. If you try it, I'll give you $100 in free credit. If you don't like it, you can delete it. And I used to do the same thing with riders. We would go hang out in front of bars and restaurants and talk to people and give them promo cards and say, here's a card. If you sign up, you get $20 of free credit. And by the way, if you invite a friend, they'll get $20 and you'll get $20. If you can convince people verbally, ideally your first 100 customers to try your product, that's the best possible scenario, because you're going to get real life feedback. They're going to be real life people. and they're not going to come through a web channel that often carries a lot of economics that are not very favorable. So I would really, once you feel good on the readiness side, I would try to find your first 100 customers manually, whether that's you and your team together. And I honestly, for the beginning, wouldn't focus too much on retention. I would focus on getting as many use cases established for those customers and try to get engagement up. So, again, for Uber, the metric for us was how many times does a rider use Uber every week? And globally, we had sort of a benchmark. Most people ride with Uber around 2.5 to 3 times a week. If we were in a city and people were using it 5 times a week and we had a really good NPS and sort of informally and anecdotally, we were getting great feedback. Forget about retention. Don't focus on a bunch of other things. Just get your product into the hands of as many customers as possible and just keep taking their feedback. And, as we grew and we went from 10 customers to 100 to 1,000, you start to introduce more data-driven ways to collect information, whether it's surveys or NPS forms and things like that. But stay close to the early adopters of your product. The first 5 to 10 people that you met that used your product, call them, take them out to lunch, get them to tell you about what they love about the product, and more importantly, get them to tell you about the things that they don't like about the product, because those are things, and that's feedback that's really difficult to get online with customers that you don't know, unless you've built, really thoughtful and productized feedback loops. So that's sort of how I think about that. I think retention comes later, retention, and I'm sure a lot of other people have different thoughts about this. Candidly at Uber, we didn't start thinking about retention until retention was a meaningful source of growth. And at Uber, we would sign up, let's say 1,000 people a week or 1,000 people a month. And over time, we would do analysis and learn, okay, we've got 10,000 existing users. We sign up 1,000 new users every week. So we've got 10% sort of gross user additions. And maybe we lose a couple hundred users a week that are churning or per month. And so over time, that became a more relevant growth channel. If we reduce the number of people that churn by X%, we can obviously grow faster. I think early on, it's probably wiser to focus on creating a great experience for the people that first use you and trying to attract as many new customers as possible, and come to retention when you've established a little bit of critical mass. On the last one on monetization, it really depends on your product. So if you're building a productivity piece of software that is going to have, a fee on a monthly basis, you should introduce that from the start. I think introducing people to your product for free is risky. Over time, if those people use your product for 6 months or 9 months, it's going to be really hard for you to introduce, a fee, and you should try to do that as quickly as possible. If you are, maybe with some credits or some discounts, your first 30 days free or your first 60 days free, or maybe the first 100 users free, because they're going to be your sort of evangelists. If you're building a social product, it's a lot harder, because social products and networks obviously have a very different business model. And so if your business model relies on being exceptionally large and generating ad revenue, then, I think the sort of industry feedback would be wait as long as possible, build the largest network as possible, get as many eyeballs as possible, and then introduce, ads and generate ad revenue. But if you have a product that you're going to charge on every transaction and you're going to charge on a monthly basis, then I would recommend charging as soon as you can as possible. If people aren't willing to pay for it early on, they're likely not willing to pay for it later on.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We asked a question to all the founders we meet, depending on what market they're selling to, whether it's B2C, mid-market, enterprise, SMB, how many customers have you interviewed about the value proposition you're trying to provide before even going to talk about pricing or even go to market strategies? And a lot of times it's shocking how little customer due diligence they've actually done. If it's a SMB, that's like maybe 10 or 15, mid-market, 25, enterprise, they maybe talk to 5 enterprise customers, and there's no consistency in the questions that they ask. So having a data-driven approach where you can actually capture consistent data on the answers and feedback, and then scaling as much as you can those conversations to as many people before you go to market, it really does save you a lot of time from catching up. I mean, think about it. If you're going to spend every waking hour building a company, wouldn't you want to have as many conversations as possible with potential customers before you actually have to sell them? And so I think that's an easy question to ask yourself is how many customers have we talked to before we even get into the selling part of the problem?
Yeah,
So,
totally. And there's some basic frameworks, that you can use to outline sort of value proposition. So, I tend to think in rows and columns in Excel, but you create sort of, what's my target customer, and then rank the existing products, price, speed, quality, quality of customer support. Come up with a couple standard attributes that you can use. And then ask all your clients or all the people in the industry or through your own experience how you'd rank and establish a value proposition rank for each one of those things for the existing products, and then do yours. And if yours isn't at least 50% better, then maybe consider working harder before you bring it to market.
that's great. Thank you. How do you minimize unnecessary spending, and what happens when you can't A/B test growth channels? Great question to ask right now in this time environment.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it changes through cycles. I think the number one thing is by building a culture and by hiring people and bringing on a team that thinks like owners. Uber from the start always had a cultural value, which is be an owner, not a renter. And the idea was, and we came up with various analogies, but if you were the last person in an office and you were walking out and the lights were on, would you actually go through the trouble of turning off the lights in the office? If you've been in a 50-person office, turning off the lights isn't actually as straightforward in a commercial space as you might think. But that's the kind of culture you want to create, where even when people don't have to, because it's not necessarily their money, it's not their startup, they do those things because they believe it's their startup, and everyone has this sort of shared accountability to spend the company's resources in a way that's going to be effective and thoughtful. And we used to ask people, occasionally, when things started getting out of hand at Uber, for example, people were buying expensive laptops that we didn't need it, or spending money on things that we didn't think were justified. Ask someone the question, would you, if I asked you in front of the entire company to justify that spend, would you be able to do it? And I think that's a really good test, because, when you raise a lot of money and you've got a lot of capital and you feel like, it's not necessarily yours, you're spending someone else's time, it gets awfully easy to spend money you don't have. So I think it starts at company culture, and it starts at recruiting, and it certainly starts with you. The example you set, on the launch team, I lived for about 20 to 24 months in Airbnbs. I didn't spend a ton of money. I didn't stay in a lot of hotels. I flew economy. I ate, not that I want to recommend eating bad food, but, I ate pretty cheap every day. And so the people that I hired looked at my example and said, Rob's working 14 hours a day. He's not going out for steak dinners on the company's dime. He's not flying, business. So how would I even go about doing that? He's the guy that hired me. He's the person who sort of my inspiration for, what I should be and how I should act within the company. So don't underestimate, leadership and how they act and culture. I think one of the things that becomes really useful as you have more of a track record and you've been running your business for a longer period of time, you've maybe got some budgeting processes, is a concept called zero-based budgeting. And it's this idea that, most companies, what they do is every year they say, okay, let's say we did $10 million in revenue and we spent, $1 million on marketing last year. Well, then next year, we're going to spend at least $1 million on marketing. So we take last year's budget and we add some amount to it, or maybe we sort of maintain the proportion relative to revenue. So if you spend $1 million on marketing and did 10 million of revenue, you spent 10% on marketing. Next year, if you do 20 million in revenue, you'll spend double that. So zero-based budgeting basically says at the beginning of the year, you start from zero. Every single line item in the company, whether that's office expenses, computers, sales, marketing, starts from zero. And your business leaders or your founders or whoever it is start with the premise of, let's justify what we think we should spend this year and start from zero. And if it means that it's less money than last year, then fine. And if it means it's more money than last year and we've got good impetus to do it, then do it. But never, never, never just repeat last year's budget, because it becomes really easy to fall into that sort of a habit. In terms of, A/B testing growth channels, if you can't do it, then don't do it and don't sweat it. Uber didn't A/B test channels for a really long time. I think I probably spent 18 to 24 months running our markets. We were so focused on new user acquisition, so focused on just keeping up with the day's work and the week's work that we weren't super analytical doing experiments between different growth channels. And that sophistication came later when we had more time, when we had better resources and data analysis resources to track that type of information. I think there's a big difference between running really big experiments that cost a lot of money and maybe doing some gut checks. So once a quarter or every 6 months, go through an exercise of refreshing what your user acquisition costs are. Estimate, what you think it costs on a fully burdened basis. For example, if you run radio ads, how much did you spend on radio ads? How many new users signed up through radio? Try to get a sense for what your user acquisition cost is. And look at that relative to the other channels you have. For example, online marketing, mobile marketing, social marketing, and do it every 6 months. And just make sure you do some gut checks to ensure you're not way off the rails. I don't think you need to run these tests every week or every month. Certainly every couple of months, once a quarter seems like a good gut check if you don't have the time or the money to be doing it that often.
What was some of the most surprising growth channels that you did not think would be so successful before you actually look back at the data when you were at Uber?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I spent so much time trying things that it was really frustrating. Like, it was poking around in the dark. Things that I thought would work massively didn't work, and things that shouldn't have worked did. Things that really worked early on were, one, guaranteed incentives for suppliers. So if you run a marketplace, your marketplace is either sort of a demand-led marketplace or a supply-led. And that means that you need one side of the marketplace to be there reliably before the other side will engage. For Uber, we had to have drivers. Before we could launch, no one was going to request an Uber, and we weren't going to let them if there was no drivers online. So how do we get the drivers online? We went around to the first 10 drivers, 20 drivers, 50 drivers in every city and basically said, look, you earn, let's say 20 euros an hour. I'll sign you up on Uber. If you're on the app for 5 hours a day for the next 7 days, I'll guarantee you 20 euros an hour. Whether you get a request or not, I'll guarantee you that. And at the end of every week, I'll query it. If I saw you were online and you were available, I'll make the payment if you didn't get the trips. And if you got the trips, then you should earn enough that you don't need that incentive. That was massively helpful for getting our first couple of drivers on board, and ultimately what allowed us to really build supply scale really quickly. Some things that didn't work really well: paid ads. Paid ads performed terribly. I, to this day, think paid marketing is the lowest value marketing that you'll probably do. It has the highest cost associated with it, the most leakage, the lowest conversion rate. For Uber, if I went and marketed through organic means, through radio ads, through word of mouth, through referrals, 3 or 4 out of every 10 signups actually became an Uber driver or an Uber rider, if not more. When we ran paid ads, online ads, maybe 1 out of 100 people who signed up actually converted. So it's a really lower quality funnel. And I think businesses that are built that are focused solely on paid marketing end up spending a ton of money acquiring their users, and can obviously end up in a really tough situation when it comes to maintaining that growth trajectory when they don't have the money to deploy into those channels.
Gotcha. So anyone who's basically lending on paid ads data is not a good business that you'd invest in.
I mean, look, I'm not a marketing expert. What I always learned about marketing is that it's got to be part of a broader, comprehensive strategy. So as an example, if you're going to you want to do let's say for Uber, for 3 months, we did supply sprints. So in Prague, for example, it was impossible to find drivers. Drivers just wouldn't sign up with Uber. So we were always supply constrained. So we decided, all right, we know people are skeptical about driving with Uber for X, Y, and Z reasons. We're going to run some billboards. We're going to run some radio ads where we're not just going to market the product to sign up, but we're going to talk about why Uber is good. We're going to talk about the benefits. We're going to actually build on the kind of awareness and consideration and get people to think about Uber in a favorable way. At the same time, we're then going to run Facebook ads. So you're going to come home. You maybe heard us on the radio. You saw a billboard. Then you came home and you saw, for the 3rd or 4th time, an opportunity to click the link to sign up with Uber. That was always much more successful than just running online ads independently and seeing if they would convert. So it's got to be part of a broader life cycle of a marketing campaign, I think.
Awesome. I guess any tips on diversifying your product line to help grow revenue as a startup?
It's tough. Like I I looked at this question for a while and was thinking about what to say. I think that it's hard because if you're doing a good job early on, you're not thinking about diversifying your product line. In fact, you're actively thinking about things you can stop doing, complexity you don't need to add, features you shouldn't build because you just want to focus on executing what you need to do this week and just continuing to deliver to customers. If you have to grow revenue and you need to do it quickly, I think I would start with your customers. I know that's sort of an easy answer, but go to your customers and take them out for dinner, take them out for lunch, and ask them, you know, what's going on in your business? What's challenged right now, for example, because of COVID, that we could be providing you? What's a problem you'd pay $100 or $1,000 to get solved, and figure out how to do it? Every business right now is going through this challenge of needing to pivot. You know, we're all reading about restaurants that their business has been decimated. They know that, you know, they have brand recognition, they have relationships with customers, and they have a physical location. You know, what are they doing? They're pivoting to grocery pickup. They're using their physical locations to their advantage by being able to store groceries close to their customers. So I think you need to talk to your customers. And, you know, I'm a believer that if you have enough conversations about what they need, you'll likely stumble upon something that you can provide them. You know, the last is think about what you do today that you don't charge for, and think about what you could charge for. So, you know, at Uber, we were really idealistic about providing as much economic value to customers and drivers at the beginning. We didn't charge for a lot of things. We used to give drivers free phones. We used to give them free data packages. We used to give them a whole host of things. And over time, we learned we needed to charge for some of these things. So think about in your existing business, are there things that you feel you can charge your customers for that are defensible, that they'll have some willingness to pay, and try to do some experiments and see if you can get them to pay for them?
Yeah, I think a lot of businesses are going through this kind of diversity conversation. Like, is it a bridge to a pivot though? Is it something you should have done before that you just didn't want to try? If you're a gym that's now going digital, are you diversifying, or are you actually pivoting to a digital platform that you could have probably done pre-COVID? You just didn't think you needed it because the ROI wasn't there for you. So make sure you calculate the ROI before you dive in with both feet to a diversifying strategy. I think as a startup, it is okay to try out a different bunch of scenarios, but back to what maybe Robbie was saying is that if you had enough of those customer conversations, you'll probably land on a place that you should have been focusing on, you know, pre-COVID. So you don't have to diversify. You already have the data on what value you can offer there. Yeah. What are some implications of expanding into other countries, additional resources, legal regulations, et cetera, that you have tips on?
Yeah, this is a good question. I could spend a lot of time talking about it. I think that, there's sort of two elements. There's the implications of expanding and deciding to expand. I think maybe to start with the latter, when you decide that you're going to expand to a market and you feel the market is ready, your product is going to be compelling, commit 100% to expanding and have the wherewithal and the ambition to commit the resources you need to make that market work. At Uber, Uber was extremely aggressive about expansion, and they were aggressive in one specific way, which is they empowered their local team to make decisions. And I think most of the companies that I talk to today, it's a founder or a CEO, they want to expand to a new market. They think about hiring someone to be in charge of that market, but they want to stay involved. And when I talk to them, it sounds like the whole company is talking about what they need to do to make that market successful. And, Uber didn't really do that. Uber dropped me in a market and said, good luck, launch Prague. We have an engineering team that can add Prague to the product list and make the product work, but regulations, marketing, hiring, that's your problem. And you can engage with HQ and you can ask for advice, but the night before launch, there's only one person that the company is looking at or that the executives are looking at and are going to look at a month later and a year later if that market worked. And that's the launcher or the general manager. And so I would try as much as you can to be decentralized early on, empower people who are in charge of expansion, and give them the sort of personal risk and the personal reward associated with successfully executing. Because if you do, they'll run through walls and they'll be that much more creative, and they're going to figure out things that you just don't have the time to do if you're sitting in another country or another city. In terms of implications, moving to another market will raise necessarily questions around resourcing. So do we have the product resources, the marketing resources, the legal resources to support that market? It's going to raise questions about, regulatory compliance and legal compliance. But more than anything, it's going to continue to lead back to this debate when you have multiple markets of which markets should we prioritize. And if your leaders or you are doing a good job, you do your pre-homework and you commit to a market and then you're all in. The hardest thing is if you launch a market and it's not going great and then you have everyone in the company going, I don't know why we launched there. The market's not that big. Now you have that team asking for things in HQ and people are sort of saying, well, should we really work on this? Is that really a good use of time? That's really tough, for example, in Canada, if your business is operating in Canada and then you launch, let's say, or in Toronto and you launch, let's say, in Montreal. Montreal is going to have tons of language requirements. So make sure there's leadership conviction. Make sure ideally that your team is committed, whether it's financially, with headcount or some sort of resources. What's this market going to get for the next 6 months, and write it down and agree on it. And don't be surprised, 3 months later when the people working on that launch that you've tasked with making it successful keep coming back and asking for resources. Be really thoughtful about how you're going to help them and how you're going to support that market. Obviously, at a larger scale, this becomes a lot more complicated. At Uber, I can admit, while we did a great job of expanding, our HQ functions didn't do a great job keeping up. I was at one point in Eastern Europe. We were in, I was overseeing like 8 or 9 cities with a team below me. We had no legal support. We had no public affairs support. We had no PR support. We were basically getting shut down in every single market I was operating in. We had drivers getting arrested. We had our offices getting raided, and no one could help me. And it sucked. And we ended up having bad outcomes because of it. We weren't as thoughtful about expansion. We weren't as thoughtful about engaging with the government because there just wasn't enough time to do it. If I could go back, I would have thought about how we could have built better sort of alignment with the leaders of those functions to say, look, the business wants to expand to these markets on this timeline. Can you grow your team fast enough? Or do you feel that your existing team can support this? If not, what are we going to do? And does that mean we should revisit expansion, or does that mean we should get creative and someone like myself should do it on their own? So those are kind of my thoughts on expansion and balancing the resourcing required for it.
That's great. I've always heard about this Uber launch playbook that people have talked about for years. And I wanted to actually ask you for a long time, was there actually a playbook for launching new cities or states or countries? Or is this some type of like mythical thing that came down from HQ and then the rest was up to you to fill in the blanks? Because a lot of startups go from Canada to the US to international markets. And I've actually never really seen this Uber launch playbook, but I would love to know if there was one that exists and if we can get a hand on it.
Yeah, no, there definitely is. I have it. It's funny. People ask me all the time, and it's not, no playbook is the silver bullet. The silver bullet and the magic is getting your company and your team built into the idea of creating a playbook and improving it. So when I joined Uber, there was 25 people on the launch team. There was this playbook, and truthfully, the playbook wasn't, here's how to perfectly do something. It was like build supply, find your first 100 drivers. Here's a couple things that have worked, walk around in front of the airport and guarantee drivers $20 an hour. Go to a limo company and guarantee them $1,000 if they give you 10 drivers for the first day. There was no real secret sauce in there that was that incredible, but it was the commitment that when I got that playbook, I went into Eastern Europe with it. I started working on it. And every week, the launchers that, were around the world, we'd all get together and we would share what was called sort of battle strategies. So what's not going well in the launch? Oh, wow. In Prague, I'm having a really hard time onboarding supply. Well, we have someone in Brazil that's had that same issue 6 months ago. And now he's on the call talking about what worked. And now we're taking notes about best practices. So the playbook was a living, breathing document on, I believe it was on basecamp.com, and we updated it. It was like a live real-time document. And so I'd go into a launch, I'd start doing things, and then I'd realize like, this is in the wrong order, or we shouldn't do this. And then I'd update it. And that was the magic. None of us really remembered the actual tactics themselves. There were some okay ones in there, but for the most part, it was just this idea of continuous improvement and writing things down. Because if you get one employee to launch successfully and then you want to launch 8 more times, simultaneously, you now need 8 people to do the same thing. And it would be a heck of a lot easier if that first employee wrote it down, how to call those people, and then sent them out into the wild, than those people just trying to, through trial and error, figure it out on their own. And that's what Uber did. And the woman who created that deserves a lot of credit. Her name's Austin Geit. She joined Uber when she was 21 as an intern. She was the 5th employee there, and she's done really well and was a great inspiration to everyone on the launch team.
That's really cool. I like that battle playbook. It sounds more perfect for the battles you went through. So it wasn't a sports betting almanac, just to be clear.
No. If you looked at the tactics in there, you're probably doing them already.
All right. Well, I guess this would kind of be in the launch playbook as well. How do you deal with aggressive competitors, Uber versus Lyft?
Yeah, it's a great question. I spent a lot of time. The last 3 years that I had at Uber were really spent a lot on this, both in Eastern Europe with Yandex, and then when I came back to Canada, a big area of my focus was competition with Lyft. And it's hard. I think that it's important to look at competition as a good thing, because competition will force you to be a better company. It'll force you to add more value to your customers, and it'll make you sharper and act with more urgency. One of the 2 things that I'd say that I took away from it were, one, financial incentives are a lever, but not the only lever. And Uber relied too heavily on financial incentives, and so to have all of the ride sharing and food delivery apps, and they're seeing the consequences of that. So, if you sell a product for $5, but you pay a user $4 to use it, so therefore you're selling it for $1, and you build a great business with tons of users giving away 80% of your theoretical revenue, there will be a day of reckoning. That day may take 5 years, it may take 10 years, but you will one day have to deal with the consequences of that. And, they're twofold. There's the financial commitment and all of the resources that consumes as you get bigger. But the bigger one is how you get out of that. Because if you've trained your users and your customers to always associate you and your brand and your product with being discounted, it's awfully hard to take them away in the future. So use financial incentives. Uber certainly did. I certainly oversaw my share of really, really big incentive budgets. It was sort of seen as a necessary evil to some extent, but be really thoughtful about, how you're going to do that, establish guardrails, try to wean customers off of that as quickly as you can. And know that ultimately you need to win on product and not win on subsidies. The second thing I'd leave you with, maybe more, that's a little more optimistic and tangible that you can take away, is to do customer segmentation sooner. When we started at Uber, or at least when I did, we always looked at users as just, they were all equal. So we would do 10,000 trips a week, and then we do 100,000 trips a week. And then eventually we got to millions of trips a week. And we always looked at them as sort of apples to apples. Like a city that does, 75,000 trips a week, let's say they have 30,000 users, we run the same tactics, the same playbook, the same partnerships. And what you need to realize once you start facing competition is that those 30,000 users are made up of much smaller collections of users. Some of them are, product evangelists. They use the product all the time. They're power users, and maybe they pay for it and they use it in their business. There's other users that are using it more casually on a more leisurely basis. For Uber, we had a business segment. These are people that are charging Uber their credit card, their corporate company credit card. They're using Uber 10 times a week. Their willingness to pay is very high. Certain features are of great value to them, others aren't. Then we had people, frankly, that were getting drunk on the weekend. Young people who were using Uber as a means to getting around on the weekend. The sooner you break your customers down into those different segments and think about how can we serve those customers, what are the specific promotions we can do with them, the specific products we can push to them, the better, because your competitors are going to do that. And that's ultimately what happened with Uber. We tried to look at all of our customers as one. And then typically what would happen is we'd have 4 competitors. One would be hyper focused on the business segment, and they just do a way better job. They had central billing and invoicing and all these administrative features that people like myself wouldn't care about on the weekends. And then we had other service providers that were doing a great job with leisure travelers, or creating services that made the service really cheap or allowed you to share a ride with friends. And so the sooner you can have your company think about those customer segments differently, create strategies differently, look at your market share differently, I think you'll be better off, and you'll think about more nuanced competitive strategies.
Do you ever think Uber will get away from those financial incentives? And did you want them to move away from it earlier when
Yeah,
they
I mean, yeah, we did, and I spent a lot of time, especially in Canada. We did a lot of quantitative analysis and like statistical analysis to figure out where we should spend subsidies, where a dollar invested here would generate greater than a dollar return. I hated subsidies. I hated them. They were a huge pain in the ass. Every market that I oversaw that introduced them, I knew one day I'm going to have to figure out how we get rid of them. So yeah, we obviously did want to get rid of them. I'm confident they will go away. I think what's happening right now with COVID is a great sort of lever for discipline. You see all these companies now pulling back on subsidies, starting to discount less, being more restrained, and that helps because there's a lot of game theory and incentives. So if Matt and I are competing for the same market, I might be sitting there going, fuck, Matt's killing me. He's spending a fortune. I don't want to do this, but if he's doing this, then I have to. And he could be sitting there going, man, Rob's killing me. He just raised another $5 million, pouring it into the market. So we both don't want to do it, but we have to do it because we both assume the other one's doing it. So when I know Matt's not doing it because the market has corrected, because financing is harder, because we're both public companies and we have very different expectations from the market, it's a lot easier for us to both spend less and actually do better.
Gotcha. It's like a race to the bottom until it's not.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, I mean, we kind of addressed this a little bit, but any tips on kickstarting some new marketplaces, tactics that you would use to boot each side of the marketplace? It depends which supply or demand side you're focused on, but thoughts?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I talked a bunch already about the financial incentives, so maybe I'll leave them there and I think be careful with them. It's interesting. Uber did some things that they were pretty quirky. I don't know that people remember them anymore, but they were really successful in building traction, and they got a lot of press attention. So, the two that stick out to me most and that people that worked at Uber will remember fondly for hating were sort of ice cream on demand and kittens on demand. And, if you don't know what those were, it was basically like one day a year, Uber would just deliver ice cream to anyone in the city, basically for free. And it was a shit show. The press would write about it. People went for some reason, people go absolutely nuts about free ice cream or getting a kitten to play with them for 5 minutes. And it was a total PR ploy in hindsight. There's no business case behind it. In fact, it cost a huge amount of money. It was a huge draw on resources. Our marketing managers hated it. It never went smoothly, but it got tons of press. And so we got written up in every city, got tons of coverage. It ended up leading to a ton of organic signups. So, don't underestimate the power of really novel things that can get you in the media. I see a lot of startups doing a great job of doing that now. Some of the startups I'm advising now are pivoting and they're helping deliver food with their team. They're using their technology to help get resources to frontline responders, and they're getting written up about it. So not to say that you want to do those things solely for the press, but if you can get a journalist or a tech blogger to write about your service, it's going to really help, build an online audience.
Yeah, I remember the puppy on demand. That was a disaster. Waiting for that puppy to come to your door for 5 minutes.
Yeah.
All right. Looking back, are there any small tactical moves in terms of growth that had larger impacts than expected? What were they? Would you do it again?
Yeah, I mean, I talked a bit about them. None of them are that glamorous or that surprising, but the things that worked for us were, radio ads, sign-up bonuses, hourly guarantees. If you're running a supply, in particular, a labor sort of supply marketplace, those worked really well. I talked a bit about the on-demand stunts and things like that. I view those as favorable. I think all of those, were a piece of the puzzle, and you need to try different things and see what works. In terms of what I would do again, I would be more restrained with financial incentives and I'd pull them sooner. So, for the first 90 days when we launched markets, just as an example, we would say, we need a driver to do X number of trips a week to make enough money for this to be worthwhile. As long as they're not doing that, we'll fill the gap. So let's say we think drivers need to make $500 a week to view Uber as a true alternative to a day-to-day job, whatever that dollar might be, right? If they made 300, we'd give them 200. What happened is as we got more efficient and people used Uber more often and drivers did more trips and we had more efficiency, drivers started to creep up and get to that $500 level. But rather than pull our incentives, which we should have, and which would have been consistent with those drivers because we told them, hey, we're going to try to get you to your kind of these level of earnings and then we're going to stop incentivizing you because you won't need them. A lot of us got greedy and we decided, well, if we keep paying incentives, we can grow even faster. And so we kept those incentives for years. And then it became impossible to pull them to the point that we had drivers that would only drive if we paid them huge amounts of incentives that never made sense. We ended up pulling them. We ended up losing those drivers permanently, and it was a huge pain in the butt. So if you're going to use subsidies, again, have a mental sort of framework for why you're going to use them, what gap they're going to fill into your marketplace, and have a time limit on them. And when you reach that point, pull them and stop doing it and be decisive about it.
Mm-hmm. One thing we try to do with our companies is get them to explain the tangible ROI to their customers in a very simple fashion. So kind of go through the back of the envelope math with them to say, hey, you're spending this much time on it. So it's either a money creator or money saver tool that you're trying to obviously sell them. If you can show them how they can save, 65% based on the actual numbers that they are giving you, there's actually ROI calculators that you can input into your agreements with customers that they can click on and play around with to say, if I spend this many hours on or so on, how much money can I save or make? Those also I seem to work quite well, at least for our B2B SaaS companies. So the assumption is that growth at all costs is based on availability of capital. Does it ever get to a point where having too much capital can be detrimental in that you end up developing an unrealistic growth strategy, i.e. soft bag money?
Yeah, 100%. I'm so glad someone asked this question. This drove me absolutely nuts at Uber, and even while I was there and a part of it, I was always wondering, like, where's this going? Again, I use the analogy, if you open up a burger stand next to McDonald's and McDonald's sells burgers for $5 and you sell them for $1 and you build a huge business and everyone's buying burgers from you, do you have a business? Where's the end game there? Now, in some businesses, there is rationale behind it. So, if you're, for example, in a very capital intensive business with equipment, and you buy a piece of equipment, and if you, use that piece of equipment to produce 100 widgets, you have very high costs. But if you produce 100,000 widgets, your variable costs come down, and now it's profitable. There's some logic in that. Ride sharing has some elements of that, but the reality is the bulk of Uber's costs and the bulk of marketplace costs are variable. So for every time a driver picks you up or someone comes to deliver food, there's a fixed amount of money they need to make. And if we deliver 100 items or 200 items, it's not really going to change that calculus. Someone's time is worth something. And I think Uber and a lot of companies over the last 10 years have taken this way too far and got to this point where they thought, some markets and some products and some growth strategies that aren't profitable are worth pursuing. And the reality is, as I said, is you'll deal with it one way or another. There's no escaping it. So at Uber, we decided to launch a lot of markets. Eastern Europe is candidly a great example. Eastern Europe had really low average fare values to the point that the market was never going to be that big for us. We invested a bunch of time and resources there. It made sense. I'm super proud of it. But while we were there, we strayed into some markets that were never going to make sense, where we had, 80-cent average fares or dollar average fares. And we sort of knew that, one day this is going to be really tough to unwind. And this doesn't really make a lot of sense. But we did it anyways, because we were really caught up in the moment and we had competitors there and we really wanted to win. And guess what? Uber's unwinding those markets now. So my lesson and what I leave with you is, be really thoughtful about this. You should be able to do really basic back of the napkin math that says, what am I selling my product for, and can we make money? And it's okay to be unprofitable for a period of time, while you're reaching some level of scale. For example, not venture businesses aren't going to cover their OpEx. So they're not going to cover all of their employee salaries to start, but you should know the number. If I sell 200 widgets and I have 5 employees, I'm going to lose, let's say, $500,000 a year. Once we sell 100 or once we sell 1,000, we can cover our costs. We can make a profit. Great, do that. And when you get to that level, make a profit. Don't just hire and respend all of that money that you've got, because one day capital won't be as easy to access, and you're going to have to make some really tough decisions. And that's kind of unfortunately what everyone's seeing right now.
Do you think that there becomes a time when Uber is able to take out a large chunk of that variable cost with maybe autonomous driving or something, and then the customer base they have is still on the platform, but the big chunk of cost that goes toward drivers is essentially removed?
I think so, but I think, the media sensationalizes autonomous vehicles, I think, in a way that, the same way that the best analogy is, we're all learning this pandemic isn't going to just like end. Like, we're not going back to pre-March 12th when Ford loosens the regulations in Ontario. We're not all going to go back to normal. There's going to be a really long step of getting back to normal, and pre-March 12th may not happen for 2 years for all we know. And I think that that's ultimately the way that you need to think about these situations is there's going to be a gradual change.
Got it. I guess now, getting towards the end of it, in the current state we are in, how do I manage growth amidst changing priorities during COVID?
Yeah, this is really tough. And I feel for people that are running a business right now. I'm trying to start a business, but we're not really selling anything yet. So we don't have any existing decisions we've made in the past or commitments that we have to right size, which is really tough. I don't have any great answers for you, to be honest. I would think hard with your advisors and your investors. What's the new goal? You can justify any strategy based on the goal. If your goal for the next 6 months is to survive, then survive. And just focus not on growth, but preserving cash, retaining the talent you can, and just biding time. And, if you need absolutely to prove product market in the next 6 months, because if you don't, you're going to run out of money, and you need to pivot and you need to create a new product, then do that. I would throw out whatever goals and whatever business plan you had pre-COVID and come back to the drawing board and say, what do I need to do in the next 60, 90 days to keep my business afloat and to continue working on that? So I just say all bets are off. Think about what you can sell and what you can do that's going to be valuable for your customers, and go do it. And don't be afraid to make big, tough decisions. I think in these moments, it's probably better to make bold, tough, negative decisions. For example, letting people go, closing markets, temporarily putting off plans, than it is to continue doing those things for 3 more months and then deciding later that you have to do them anyways. That's almost never the right answer.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. Throw out your 2020 playbook, because it definitely isn't going to come true anymore. But one thing we've said is, first off, determine what kind of COVID impact you have as a company. Are you COVID resistant? Are you COVID affected? Or are you COVID mission critical? If you're COVID mission critical, like, telemedicine, it's growth at all costs now. This is your time. But if you're COVID resistant, where you can still operate with your existing customers, I don't know if growing is the right way to phrase it, but you can still maintain the sales momentum you had pre-COVID. If you're COVID affected, solvency is your only goal.
Yeah, and you should frame that to your sort of stakeholders, investors, board. I think a lot of companies that for the next 6 months, if 6 months from now your business is still operating, you've retained some talent, and you're just running the ship, you're paying the bills, and you're maintaining some level of revenue. I think for a lot of businesses, that's a great accomplishment. You should sit with your board or whoever it is and say, hey, this industry declined 90% and my revenue declined 50%. That's the goal. We did it. Celebrate it. You need to celebrate those small wins. And, I'm seeing a lot of companies that I advise now doing that, where a good week is doing 30% of the volume they did a year ago or 6 months ago. And hey, that's the sacrifice that you make, but ultimately you'll be better off in the long run if you can achieve those small wins in the meantime.
And if your competitors are not thinking that way and they're down 90%, they don't make it. You came out as the survivor, even though you're down 50%, and then you could hopefully ratchet back up quicker because the competition is not chasing at your heels. All right. Yeah. Well, that takes to the end of the Typeform questions. Thank you very much, everyone, for submitting those. We'll give it a minute or so to see if anyone has any additional questions to plop into the Zoom chat. But Robbie, I really appreciate you taking the time. This is really exciting. I think the last question I would like to ask is, where do you see Uber, today with new management, being a public company, going in the next, 5 to 10 years, well past.
I'm still super bullish on Uber. Like full disclosure, I still hold most of the stock that I got at Uber. I'm super bullish on it. I watched Uber go through a ton of tough growing pains, and this sort of relates to incentives and growth at all costs. Uber over the last 2 years has made some big boy or girl adult decisions. We can't do this. We're going to do that. We have to say bye to these people. Or we decided we can't win this market, so we're not going to do it, but we're going to put 100% of our focus into this. And I'm proud of like the whole company and what they've done. They've made a lot of tough decisions and come out the other end, and maturing into a big mature company is not easy. I'm super excited. I mean, the Eats business has grown. I think on the call last week on the investor call, they said the Eats business is up 50 or 60% year over year. There's going to be long-term permanent changes in consumer adoption of food delivery. I really believe, and I think Uber is well positioned to take hold of that. The ride sharing business, it's interesting. So much of what we've talked about covers this topic, but ride sharing is a pretty fast growing business still. I think it's, in the mature markets, 15% a year, and in the fast growing markets, probably closer to 30 or 40% per year. But the nice thing is that all of the competitive battles that Uber was in historically, with Lyft, with Yandex, with Didi, those have stopped. The subsidizing has basically completely stopped. And so I think when the market does come back, you may end up, and we sort of talked about this, it may not be 100% of prior volumes. It may be 90%. Next year, Uber might do 85% of its ride sharing volumes, but it's going to be, I think at least, much more profitable because it's going to have that much more of a rational environment to be in. And then the last is there's obviously just a great leadership team there. There's a great team there. There's a great track record of innovation and really bold decision making. So I'm confident whatever developments in the industry Uber is already in / new industries that it wants to enter, Uber is going to continue to be really bold in the future and is going to capture a ton of value from the markets that it's in and the markets that it goes to.
That's awesome. We do have a question that came in. It's regarding customer acquisition. Acquiring customers by standing on the street, talk to customers directly is more expensive than through performance marketing. Why do you recommend to use such an expensive tool if you can acquire customers through performance marketing and then survey them?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a fair point. So my point is not to say, at any scale, you should go talk to customers in the street. I think my comment was more early on. If you're in the first 12 months of operations, and I could be wrong, maybe in a SaaS context or a different business model, it's totally different. Online ads for us just never worked. The first 25,000 people, the first 20,000 people that used Uber in every city, hands down, it was from word of mouth. My friend used this product in front of me. It's so incredible. I have to have it. The product spoke for itself, and we did a lot of that promotion ourselves, talking to people we know, talking to influencers, getting celebrities, for example. We'd meet a celebrity through someone. We'd say, hey, we're promoting this product. It's relevant for your demographic. Try it. If you think this is great, would you promote this? Maybe we'll come up with some side arrangement with them. The economics for us were always better doing things closer to word of mouth marketing and referral marketing. So getting existing users to be motivated to refer our product than to just running Google ads. If you're seeing great results on the Google ad side, ignore my advice and do it. I do think obviously, for the last 3 or 4 years while I was at Uber, when Uber was much larger than when I was starting those markets at the beginning, of course we did that stuff. But it was really expensive. The customers that came through paid marketing were almost always lower quality, lower engagement, higher churn. If your business doesn't see that, then that's awesome. You run a great business, and you should continue to hone it and leverage those channels.
Gotcha. Yeah, one more question. If you have customers that are pushing back during COVID, maybe even looking to boycott your systems, how do you handle that? And will investors seeing you give a lower priced product be viewed negatively when they're only interested in growth during COVID? I can answer the second part, but in the first part, how would you deal with customers looking to either boycott or get a free platform usage during COVID?
Yeah, I mean, look, I guess there's some reference here to Uber, and I'm not at Uber anymore, so I'm probably not the de facto authority here on, there's been some articles I've read about pushback with restaurants and Uber Eats and things like that. I think that, if you're running a business right now and you're getting pushback from your customers, then do your best to help them. Do your best to pivot. Do your best to take their feedback. Now, the reality of running a really big business, and this was really tough at Uber because Uber was a really, really, really large business that had very large transaction volumes, but relatively small dollar volumes. So, Uber had the opportunity every week to delight, 1 million customers and the opportunity to disappoint 1 million customers. And so when one customer is really unhappy and they complain about it, it sucks. They can be really loud and they may have very credible feedback, but sometimes as a business, you decide, I can't help that person, or I can't help that segment, or we can't serve this customer demographic anymore. And, I think that if you're getting pushback from customers right now, think about the feedback they're giving you, think about what you can do today to help them. And if you don't have the resources, I know when I was at Uber, we had some customers who wanted things from us. We just said, we can't do that. The product features they want are too expensive. We can't, our product is not relevant for them. We can't provide subsidies to them, or we don't feel good about them being a long-term fit with our brand. And so acquiring them and keeping them is going to be really expensive. And we just said no. And honestly, if you have customers that you can't satisfy, choosing to stop satisfying them and trying to satisfy them, you focus on a group that you can, if you feel it's justified, is hugely liberating. And I think most people, don't want to admit that. You always want to serve customers, and especially in a moment like this. But, if you've got business, I've got a friend who runs a large dog walking business, and we've talked about the concept of firing customers, where he says, some customers, no matter what I do, I can't help them. I can't serve them. I feel bad for them because I'm just not equipped to do it. And I just don't work with them. And I just don't worry about it because, sleep lost over that is sleep lost forever.
Yeah, I totally agree. Saying no to customers is a hard thing to do as a startup, but it's a necessary thing to do. And also, I think Uber's in a very unique position where they not only are the rails and the infrastructure for a lot of these small businesses to be able to deliver their goods, but they're also the ones who have to deal with all the customer success inbound problems, where you don't see like Shopify dealing with anything that goes wrong with a delivery of a t-shirt or some sort of package. But when it comes to food and transportation, Uber is at the front lines taking a lot of the brunt of it. But maybe they aren't the ones who actually are the ones who started the problem. It could have been the restaurant or something like that. So it's hard to be balancing both, the end user versus the actual customer that's the restaurant on the platform as well.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, that ends the Tank Talk today. Thank you so much, Rob. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, anytime.
Thanks for everyone who joined. We'll put this link up online shortly, and please feel free to share it with your friends soon. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks, guys.
Take care. Bye.